Hello, everybody. My name is Tobias Salathé. I'm working at the Secretariat of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands and would like to share with you our views on the very relevant theme of this year's Society of Wetlands Scientists meeting on how to connect wetland research, policy and practice. I'll be focusing mainly on policy and practice as most of you researchers, and therefore I don't have to tell you much about what you already know. What are the current challenges in that? Let's remember, more than 50 years ago, for the first time, those marshes, swamps, reeds, rivers and lakes were looked at from a different angle. At a meeting which took place in 1962, the so-called MAR conference, MAR for marshes, marismas in Spanish or maricas in French, and which took place at a small tourist town in the delta of the Rhone River at the Mediterranean coast, the Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. This was really the beginning of finally recognizing the scientific, the educational, cultural, social and economic aspects of those ecosystems. It was undertaken by a few of the major wetland-related NGOs and backed up by UNESCO, therefore the theme which I was just summarizing. At about that time, in the 60s, that new term, bringing all the marshes, swamps, rivers, reeds, bogs and fens together under the term wetland, was born and since used. That led through a series of rather dire and difficult preparatory meetings to the adoption in '71 on the 2nd February of a global environmental treaty which is focusing on those ecosystems, and that was in that hotel which you see on the picture here in the small seaside resort of Ramsar at the Iranian shores of the Caspian Sea, which itself can be considered as a large wetland. At the beginning it was 18 countries who were there and signing. As of today, there are 171, so most of them. However, if we're looking back 50 years later, we haven't been very successful because the first substantial global wetland outlook that was published with the help of many of you in 2018, it shows that even since that new focus on those ecosystems in the 70s, they continue to disappear. And the trend has not been changed or even stopped yet. Natural wetland types continue to decline, partly because they are drained and filled up, partly because they are turned into different wetland type, human-made types, of water retention reservoirs, of fish farms, of aquaculture pond, etc. Those are increasing in extent. Together with the decline, naturally many wetland-dependent species decline as well, and the highest risk of this is in the tropics. You know that, we know that, and that is certainly where the problems, the priority problems lay. Also, the water issues are becoming more and more frequent and dire. The water quality, which is under stress from increased pollution from agricultural and urban and industrial sources, but also water quantity, water flows in times of droughts, which are becoming in many areas more frequent due to the change. So maybe to better understand why we are not more successful, let's look back and see if we can find some lessons from the past. At that time, in the 60s, when two very specific group of stakeholders with specific interests came together in Les Saintes-Maries, in the Mar Conference, and subsequently then in Ramsar. It was mainly people like many of us, scientists, interested in nature, bird watchers, who had an interest on those migrating birds, the wetland-related birds essentially, and the ecosystems they are living on. They were added and joined by similar interested people, the waterfowl hunters, who had a very strong and still have a very strong interest in those birds for harvesting some of them and therefore for maintaining their habitats. So the point is really clearly defined groups with clearly defined interest in the wetlands. They then got the help by legal experts and diplomats who helped them through a series of those preparatory conferences to come to create that agreement, and also a wider in favor for wetland movements. They were rather forward-looking, those who were drafting the framework, the text of the convention, by not sticking only to their initial interest, the migratory water birds, although that was put in the long title of the agreement, but by inventing or creating formally something much ahead of time, which was then called bias use, which was only in the 1980s, taken up in the wider environmental scheme as sustainable use. Of course, again, some stakeholder groups with specific interests, like foresters or fishermen, had that sustainable use principle already before applied to the resource they were using. But for the first time in the 60s, and then since the 70s formally, that wise use or sustainable use principle was applied to ecosystems, those water-related ecosystems, or wetland, how they are subsumed in one word since. A word which is still not very popular, especially in other languages than English, because people are still much more familiar with my village pond or the big marshes or the swamp behind our place, or a lake or a river, or whatever the specific different wetland types are called. So the Global Wetland Outlook summarize this also together with input of many of you, what have been and what continue to be the status and trends of those wetland ecosystems. It is good to note that we are in the last 50 years have at least increased the number of data on those statuses and their accuracy. We are currently also, as part of the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Nations, trying to put those wetland ecosystems higher up on the global agenda by having the Ramsar Convention being the custodian for monitoring through the national reports by its parties, by the countries who signed it, of the extent in square kilometer of their different wetland types, and how that extent is changing over time as a first database important for developing based upon that policy actions. So wetlands are recognized together with forests and agricultural areas as the main water-related ecosystems, which are monitored together by Ramsar and UNEP. Certainly, thanks to scientific research and increased understanding and knowledge, we know better now where the priorities are regarding threatened species, threatened habitats, but also regarding water shortages and decreasing water qualities. We have certainly developed in the last 50 years an increasing understanding of what ecosystem services are, how they function, and what they actually provide to human societies. We are rather at the beginning of understanding the issues on carbon stores, on the long-term carbon stores, because just the short-term carbon cycling through vegetation cycles is not climate relevant. And if I'm saying we, I'm not necessarily thinking only about the specialists, those scientists who are specialists in that particular area, but I'm thinking about a larger set of scientists, of people in our societies, and those people are not yet very clear. There are not yet very clear messages developed about greenhouse gas fluxes between wetland ecosystems and the atmosphere above them. Some people, like from the World Meteorological Organization, mainly consider wetland ecosystem as main methane gas emitters, methane as a relatively strong greenhouse gas, without distinguishing between what part of those gas fluxes and emissions are part of the natural functioning of an ecosystem and what parts are added by human alterations or interventions. So that's why I'm arguing that we are still at the beginning of the understanding and of the communication of our understanding into clear-cut key messages for then taking up by those who are making policies. We are certainly increasing our understanding on the biological production linked to wetlands, be it only the water they provide for drained agricultural fields or for irrigated agricultural plots, but also about producing food or fodder for our livestock inside wetlands, inside different parts of wetlands, and building or different materials from wetland vegetations. That is increasing and probably needs to be more communicated also to the non-specialists. We are, again, I would suggest, rather at the beginning of quantifying the ecosystem services for specific local context where the policy implementers, or those who are then taking decision how that should be done better, need economic data, and in order to make trade-offs between different options. Again, we are probably still missing many more examples and many clear messages how those wetland ecosystem services can be evaluated or are evaluated in specific contexts, in integrative economic contexts. The Global Wetland Outlook does a good job in providing an analysis of the change, the pressures which are creating change in wetlands and the drivers behind the pressures. The concept which is presented there, in where a distinction is done by the direct drivers of change, like what you see on the picture, that marshes have been drained for agricultural crops, that behind those direct drivers there are indirect drivers which are probably linked to land use policies and increasing pressures on the land, which itself is again a consequence of global trends of the increase of the human population. So this distinction is certainly very helpful to provide the right arguments and messages to those who have to write a policy which hopefully will be adopted by decision maker politicians for implementation on the ground. So to say, and that is well summarized in the Global Wetland Outlook, there has been a lot of work on concepts, on conceptual responses, and also thinking about incentives for dealing in a more sustainable or in a wiser way with wetlands. To illustrate this, you're not supposed to read all that, but there has been an analysis done how wetlands support the achievement of all the Sustainable Development Goals. There are specific links for all the 17 of them. They are briefly summarized, and you can get this on the website of the Ramsar Convention if you want to go into more detail. So the argumentation, the conceptual structure behind has been elaborated. It is concluded that our policies, our strategies would be better if they respond to multiple challenges rather than just to one challenge, to one objective. It is important to have in our mind how we integrate those ecosystems into spatial planning, land use planning. Of course, we know, at least in theory, that such policies need to be backed up by rules, by legal rules and arrangements that policies need to be implemented. This may not be working without some financial incentives, so some context here. And increasingly, we understand that we would want and we would need to invest more in restoration of those ecosystems. It is certainly better to integrate more than one perspective if you want to succeed. And then, as a background way of doing so, we need to improve and certainly to update regularly our inventories, and to do that we can make use of citizen science as long as our data collection systems are sufficiently robust for any kind of citizen to collect them and for allowing for meaningful scientific analysis. So the concept to the responses are there, and the principle of needing incentives is. So in a sense, those 50 years of research and development have certainly much advanced our understanding, the methods we improved the methods we are using, and gave us a number of tools that are very helpful. However, we seem to be stuck at that point when trying to link the understanding, the scientific understanding, with the making of policies and the guidance for practitioners. I'm not so sure what you would be answering to that question if our scientific knowledge is communicated sufficiently in order that it does improve the understanding of those who write the policies. Are the scientists, the researchers sufficiently involved in that aspect? And then the next step, are those who are writing the policies, are they succeeding in convincing those who are doing the concrete planning, the politicians who take decisions and put forward incentives or rules for those who have to implement them? And such policies, if they have been taken and adopted, are they providing sufficient incentives of economic or other nature that they convince those people in the field, the practitioners, with doing what the policies ask them to do, and with actually being able to see that changed behavior, that doing differently as being advantages compared to what they were doing before. If you're looking for answers to those three fundamental questions in the nexus between research, policy, and practitioners, we are falling essentially into a black hole. Until you tell me otherwise, there's not yet much to be found in this field. Cooperation. So there are clearly links missing here in, like what you see here on the picture, a typical Central European landscape with a wetland, which is a river which is partly human alterated, partly also restored and providing a good stopover site for migratory birds, but essentially also a wetland in an urban landscape. So how can we integrate those wetland-based solutions which we are speaking about into our plans, like of those communes you see on the pictures, how to deal with their challenges of land use planning, of probably change of land use, of water management for their industrial and domestic uses. The Global Wetland Outlook does touch upon this, on the policies, which I think we would all agree should be based on scientific facts and understanding, rather than on beliefs or religions of all sorts, and they need to be fit for what the society needs. And that would probably be the best starting point for an increased cooperation between us scientists and those who write the policies. I would argue that a lot needs to be done in these fields, and that it is a two-way process from the scientists to the policymakers, and the other way around, from the policymakers to the scientists. And probably we need the help of some specialists who facilitate that mutual exchange and discussion. First of all, we probably should step a little bit out of our comfort zone and starting not to work and to communicate in our language only, but trying to understand what is my partner's language, what does he or she see as a priority, and how does he or she set up their framework and their reality within which they are working. And that could be helping us to translate our science, our scientific results into a language that is understandable to those who are not the specialists we are. And we certainly need to develop more the process of communicating our science to society. And in the other way, it's probably not the best approach to develop a wetlands policies with the objective to maintain as many wetlands as possible, but using the language of other stakeholders, of other societal parts of the society, who identify what are the main challenges that the society asks for their policies, like something for producing locally healthy food for our citizens, or for producing locally sufficient clean water for our uses, domestic, agricultural, and other, and producing the necessary circular economies also to deal with sewage water and things like this. So identifying such challenges coming from the communes, from the society, and how they should be covered by policies, and how the wetland ecosystems can be integrated into those policies, is hopefully more successful than just starting with our own preaching what we believe is the most important for us notably the wetland ecosystems and their species. Together with those policymakers from different boards, and probably with the help of facilitators, we would be able to define better sustainable objectives for common policies, and also how to derive from them strategies how to reach the objectives of the. A few examples of such wetland-related themes of policies which are necessarily mainly focused on social and economic issues could be, and these are the ones where many of you and many of other people are currently working on, the context of sustainable agricultural practices to produce healthy food in healthy ecosystems, as I mentioned before, which includes the maintenance of biodiversity. It probably includes also replacing drained forms of agriculture with wet forms of agriculture, paludiculture, and linked to many aspects of water management. The other major issues we have been touching upon before is about clarifying the carbon sequestration process from the atmosphere to vegetation and the ground, and especially the long-term storage of carbon inside the ground in order to really reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases. Notably, food restoration of wetlands such as classical peatlands, but also those peatlands which are rather known as salt marshes or seagrass beds, or then the mangroves, which all the three last ones are now being called under blue carbon and have a huge carbon storage potential in the long term in their ground. Another subject would be, as was illustrated before, clarifying the wetland ecosystem services in urban environments, as most of the people in the world, more than half of them, are living now in an urban environment, and clarifying what these services are and quantifying them as well in the local context for the water management, for the local climate, recreation, for us inhabitants, but also for biodiversity maintenance or enhancement. And finally, another major issue is also landscape planning and land use planning, including changes of land uses between agriculture, forestry and others. Again, a major issues on those integrated approach. This is but 4 or so of those concrete policies. Others are certainly worked on and could be. I'm just wanting to give you an example on how that could be. That is how we can get from policy to practice. A few years ago, the Nordic and Baltic countries, under their wetland initiative, have come together and said we are focusing now on peatlands. They started with scientific assessments of the extent, how much extent of peatland do they have, bogs, fens, mires, how much carbon stored per hectare or so would that be roughly. They worked together in a collaborative program. They did elaborate together a policy. You see the two outputs, the report Peatlands and Climate in a Ramsar context brings the inventory and the overall detailed picture. The left-hand brochure is the Peatlands Climate Change Mitigation and Biodiversity Conservation Policy Brief for the Nordic countries, and the Nordic ministers have adopted that as a policy. And then they continue to do some follow-up activities by providing training for managers or practitioners, those who are actually working on the sites, and are as an incentive to get into concrete restoration projects at different sites that needed some CEPA, so communication, education, participation and awareness activities to transfer what they have learned or what they are suggesting under this exercise, also to bring that to other places other countries and maybe other parts of the world. So that was, in that sense, quite helpful. And I think your society has shown itself also that you are already looking towards a way of working, which I would argue is most likely to be the most successful one, by getting beyond the development of concepts of integrated guidance and guidelines and how to do checklists, which we have elaborated a lot on, which we have available, but rather focusing on specific cases, like what is illustrated here, where a number of you have worked on the Ohrid Lake shared between Albania and North Macedonia, and notably also on those Studenčiste marsh at the edge of it, which would be a useful place for restoration, for re-wetting, for bringing wetland ecosystem services back. You've started, or you've done, a number of interdisciplinary analysis, made assessments and proposals for management, initiated the cooperation with the authorities. They have taken note of what you are doing. They have analyzed what you are doing. They are getting on board. It does take some time, but there are positive returns, and eventually certainly the political decisions would be made for providing necessary protection status for launching some restoration projects. One would probably have to need to find some investors or some donors to provide incentives or the start-up capacity to do so. But all this is now ongoing and could be useful examples for maybe things the Society of Wetland Scientists could be focusing in the near future by providing your lessons, our lessons from the scientific side, based on specific case studies, on specific measurements, including economic ones, that can be used or replicated elsewhere. So that would be my final illustration on that theme, from the research to the policy and the practitioners, and wishing you a very successful virtual meeting and obviously the continuation of our common work. Thank you and bye-bye.